Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I feel like we're running, my whole introduction is about the ISP, so I feel like we're running early for an ISP event, but thank you for those of you, those folks who are joining online. We hear that you're anxious for us to get started, so we're just going to get going because I know there's a lot to say. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Academic Engagement here at the Whitney, and I'm honored and delighted to introduce tonight's program, which celebrates the publication of this volume, Mary Kelly's Concentric Pedagogy, Selected Writings, which has been edited by Juli Carson. I'm going to put that there for a second. And if you haven't already seen, we have them for sale in the back. More on that in a second. In the first essay in the book, which is entitled Concentric Pedagogy Toward an Ethics of the Observer, Kelly begins with the statement, "When I was first invited to the Whitney Independent Study Program in 1985, it was at the high point of the feminism and postmodernism debate." It would be hard, I think, to overstate the foundational role of the ISP's curriculum over the last 4 decades. And he's not here yet, speaking of ISP time, but I'm very grateful to Greg Bordowitz, the director of the ISP, along with Sarah Nadal-Melcio and Laura Busby, the current ISP staff, for their partnership on tonight's event. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't also say thank you to Ron Clark for your steadfast commitment to the program for over 5 decades. We wouldn't be here without you. Kelly's work as a teacher and artist is also deeply connected to the Whitney Museum. Her work has been included in 3 Whitney biennials, 1991, 2004, and now 2024. In this most recent edition, Lacunae, a project which Kelly has said will be her last, that's what I've heard. Maybe that's too dramatic of a thing to say. This new project has been put in dialogue with work by her student, Sharon Hayes, and Carolyn Lazard, who studied with Hayes. Intergenerational dialogues like this are beautifully woven throughout concentric pedagogy, which has many contributors, and we're so happy that several of you are here with us tonight. And I really just want to take a moment to thank my wonderful colleagues, Meg Only and Chrissy Isles, co-curators of the 2024 biennial, for giving us a great occasion around which to host tonight's program. And congratulations to them too. I think we should clap. I do think we should clap. In her own education, Kelly studied at St. Martin's School of Art in London, where she began her long-term critique of conceptualism informed by the feminist theory of the early women's movement. In the ensuing 5 decades, Kelly's work as an artist has investigated questions about sexual difference, labor, war, trauma, and the politics of care. Her method as a teacher emerged from and with her research-driven practice as an artist. And probably needless to say, for all of you here tonight, that research-driven practice, sorry, I went off script and I totally messed it up. Really messed it up. Sorry, I want to say, I want to say that rather than an identifiable subject matter, feminism has been the method for this practice. As both an artist and as a teacher, which I think kind of co-emerged, but hopefully we'll hear more about that tonight. I think we will. So tonight, Kelly is joined in conversation by Juli Carson, who edited the book and wrote an essential essay about Mary's method, Concentric Pedagogy, as the introduction to the volume. And they will be in dialogue with Carrie Lambert-Beatty about this project and the insight it gives into Kelly's approach to teaching, its entwinement with her own artistic practice, and the incredible transformational effect that her pedagogy has had on a younger generation, I should probably at this point say generations, of artists and the field of contemporary art more broadly. So I'm gonna introduce each of these 3 wonderful thinkers, writers, and teachers, and their bios are abbreviated so that we can get to the conversation, but I am gonna remind everyone we have books for sale in the back, and Mary and Juli will sign them, and we encourage you to buy them. We actually didn't get as many as we ordered, so help us sell out. And if you don't get one, you can come back because we're getting more. So Mary Kelly is currently the judge, I'm going to get it wrong, Whitney?
That's fine,
Whitney, like Whitney, but with a D. Okay, the Judge Whitney Professor in the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California. She taught at UCLA from 1996 to 2016, where she founded the Interdisciplinary Studio Program. She also served as director of studio at ISP and continues to be a member of the ISP faculty. Juli Carson is professor of art at the University of California, Irvine, where she directs the critical and curatorial area of the Department of Art. She is also director of UCI's University Art Galleries, and her research and writing focus on the convergence of psychoanalysis, hermeneutics, and conceptual art. Alongside her work as the editor of Mary Kelly's Concentric Pedagogy, Carson organized the exhibition On the Passage of a Few People Through a Rather Brief Period of Time, which features project-based work by a younger generation of artists who have worked closely with Kelly. And the show, as I understand it, is currently on view at the UC Irvine Galleries through April?
April 7th.
Through April 7th. And Carrie Lambert-Beatty is professor of history of art and architecture and art, film, and visual studies at Harvard. Her research interests include performance, political and activist art, reception and spectatorship, and the aesthetics of deception. She is the author of the book Being Watched, Yvonne Rainer and the 1960s, and essays including 12 Miles, Boundaries of the New Art Activism, and Make-Believe, Parafiction, and Plausibility. And she's a co-editor of October magazine. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mary Kelly, Juli Carson, and Carrie Lambert-Beatty.
Can everyone hear me? Is this great? I am beyond thrilled. I'm honored to be here. So thank you very much for giving me this chance to talk with you both and with you all. And I think that I'm just going to start in. I have a lot of questions. So I would like to start by asking about the title of the book and the significance of concentric. What is that word? What work is that word doing?
Right. Probably not as much as you think it does. It came about because when I taught at Cal Arts for a couple years in 1987, it was when Michael Asher was doing his legendary critique method. The artists would be in the hot seat and they'd be interrogated over maybe hours and hours. And when I came, I introduced a method where the artist didn't speak and everyone else had to do the work of deciphering it. And the joke started to go around campus, like, are you taking the phallocentric critique or the concentric critique? So I said, okay, the book should be Concentric Pedagogy. And then, of course, the publisher said, well, it should be Mary Kelly's Concentric Pedagogy, which I suppose in a sense that captures the eccentricity of it. But in a way, that was the moment that I started to think about what it had to do with my practice within the women's movement. I didn't connect the method immediately to that way in which we had started out in consciousness-raising groups to listen. It was really the practice of listening, and the slogan was, we don't speak for others. So in a way, it fell into place that in thinking about the work of art, that the artist has made the visual proposition. Why are you asking them to defend it or explain it? Why are you going to the wall text? Why are you going to the artists themselves for the work? That there's something about listening, in this case being a form of looking, So in looking at the work, you're actually acknowledging the difference of the other there, right? So that's how we came to think of sitting around in a circle, non-hierarchical. And maybe that's how the students came up with the idea of concentricity.
But there's also a psychoanalytic theory understanding, right, of concentric. Julie, you talked about that in the introduction. I learned a lot.
Well, I'm going to, you know, Michel Montreuil, French psychoanalyst that was in Mary's list of people that she taught, was actually theorizing a model of concentricity differently. And why don't you say a little bit about that?
Well, I think that was trying to grapple with a way of understanding the drives and the difference between the way in which the Oedipus complex is resolved for men and women. But I honestly don't think that that has a very direct bearing on the teaching method. That has a very direct bearing on my practice as an artist and how I thought through the section 4 of postpartum document in thinking about the woman's closeness, incestuous closeness to the mother's body. I think that's a different concept. I really think we need to stick with the anecdote for how this became concentric.
But there was another psychoanalytic moment that prior to the little rabbit hole of Michelle, but that I bring up, but which is that the artist as spoken by the artwork in as much as they speak for it. And in the Asher model, one is speaking for the work that they made, and this model, one is acknowledging that the work is sort of done, and that in addition to deciphering the work, almost like a rebus related to real discursive sites that were all determined by in art production and history, that something else happens there. So that's a psychoanalytic component. I mean, it's not proscriptive or ideological. It's just that, you know, we're spoken by what we make in the public sphere.
Can I probe on that for a second?
Yeah.
Because I think that's such an important notion. First of all, because I think in a kind of general understanding, often I think anybody who's a conceptual artist or post-conceptual artist or identifies that way tends to get lumped together. And the idea that the object or the work is so important is not necessarily the way that that is represented out in a general sphere, right? So that, you know, and there's even art history about this, about how it is that artists went from a kind of mid-century model of silent, stoic genius who just drank a lot to get rid of all their issues to the speaker who probably also drank a lot to get rid of all their issues, but
it's a model.
It's a model. No, but the idea that you had to be able to talk the talk, right? That you had to that was an important part of an artistic education in the like post-60s period is kind of a truism.
Yeah.
And but your model goes against that and or nuances that quite a bit. And so the idea that the work is in the center and that the work is the other, is that right? How you were able to kind of transfer the idea of subject-object relations into a concentric model?
Yeah, but just to be kind of clear in the way I think about it, I noticed that immediately Julie is, you know, relating it to my work, which is something that you do in the book. But the most important thing for me in terms of the teaching context was to make a separation between making work and being a viewer of work. Right. So that's what I meant by the becoming of an ethical observer. Right. Because what you do in your own practice doesn't allow that kind of compromise, right? But if there's anything central to our profession in art, it's that we know how to look at something and to read that almost like a child learning to read from a book in the beginning. You don't know what those signs mean until you put it in order. There is a logic in the way I see it to the process of making art that's very similar. If you took Saussure's formulation in terms of the written and spoken language and saying it's the smallest acoustic unit that you put together with a concept that come up with a sign, and you just transfer that to think it's the smallest visual unit, like a brushstroke, right, that you put together with a concept to come up with a sign. You know, there's what Carrie was saying about the importance of the object is seeing the object as having its own signifying material reality. So that brushstroke, if it's got impasto, it's calling attention to the medium, and it's existentially kind of bound to the person who makes it. You see the trace of the activity. If you're doing something that's realistic, you're going to have to use mode of relief, modeling in relief, which means you can't have the impasto. I mean, it's not open to a kind of interpretation in that sense. So if you do this forensic analysis, this close reading, beginning in the smallest place and working then to the signifying system as a whole, which acts very much in the same way the written and spoken language does in terms of having a lexicon and a syntax, then you're able to it's not just a close reading, but it's a transcription in a way of what the artist has done. Because interpretation is loaded with projection. As Gayatri Spivak said, there's violence in interpretation, the imposition of analogies. So if you think of how would you get in the position as a viewer to be able to understand that? And that's where this ethical dimension comes up, where I say you're no longer making something or producing something. It's more, as Giorgio Agamben says, the ethical possibility is in the medial space where you're supporting and enduring. So you move back from the object. Projection is out. It means, whether you like it or not tells you absolutely nothing about the work. It tells you a lot about yourself, right? But not about the work. So in this position, and I know Carrie is kind of in line with this when she talks about the parafictional work, which, as I understand it, is also a kind of epistemological question about what kind of knowledge does the artwork produce. And it can't produce that knowledge unless you've given yourself up to being in that completely anticipatory space. I think that's how I would describe it. Nothing but anticipation. In the way, Descartes says that wonder is anterior to passion. It doesn't have any affect. It doesn't have any opposite, right? And then even later writers like Yuri Garay would say, yes, it's wonder poses itself against judgment. So what you're doing in front of the work is not judging something. So I guess, to make a long story, come back to what you're saying about the old methods, what we might think of as male-dominated kind of studio practice, is all about judgment.
Yes.
And so there's no recognition of the other. There's no acknowledging of the radical, uncompromising difference of that object. It is not you, right? And to learn something, you have to be at that distance. Yeah.
It's so interesting how it resonates with the way that a different way of talking about the agency of objects and decentering the subject has been a really generative idea for folks lately. And it sits so, it's not the same, but it sits very nicely there.
Yes, yeah. And I think there's something important there in terms of thinking about objects as having some agency, right? And particularly like Jane Bennett mentions in Vibrant Matter, this is not the same kind of agency as the subjectivity we discuss using the psychoanalytic discourse, but it is something that will acknowledge that the object is there. It's not just waiting in the old Descartesian way for us to recognize it. It is there, and it is even in excess of what the artist made. It has significance, right? That's in excess of meaning. So there's two audiences, the artist and those who are kind of deciphering, that are both in for a surprise as they kind of unravel this. And that's really an incredible pleasure in doing the critique. People who've been in it will recognize that moment when it was nothing like you thought it was after you get to the end. And when people have this kind of aha moment, I think it's a form of knowledge that comes from that visual experience. Mm-hmm.
So since I've never been in your class, because I'm not an artist, can you help me like just visualize, like how do you actually get started with that method? Who talks first and what do they say?
I see people who have been in my class and they kind of do their own versions of it now. And some people say, no, I don't do the close your eyes bit, or I do this part of it or this part of it. But one of the most important things about being able to put yourself in that position of, say, the ethical observer, anticipatory, is actually to, I don't know, if you close your eyes, that's literal, but what you're doing is really emptying out any kind of preoccupation, so you're ready to receive something. So what I call this the phenomenological aspects of perception are things that you take in just in the first second. Like if you walk around the biannual, you've taken in 90% of what the work is about in this much time. But you don't understand it until you start to unravel where that came from. Like something that you felt in your body, somatically, is caused, in a sense, by a whole set of signifying relations in the work. For example, lighting is just something that artists always control. If you spotlight something, there's no way you can get around the signified of theatricality. If you want a no-nonsense, kind of take on the work, you're going to have to make that lighting uniform. There's also, phenomenologically speaking, the size of the work in relation to your body. That's not up for interpretation. It's either smaller than you or it's bigger than you. And those things have profound effects, right? And so in those first moments, just backing off and saying, oh, I've already been disposed to this being immersive. Or if it's an installation, oh my God, well, where's the frame? Mayor Shapiro talked about the non-mimetic, everything up to and including the frame, right? But oftentimes with installation work, you are in the frame. It means there's no single point of view, where you're going to get the total gestalt. That has to be recognized. The artist's intention is clear. It's absolutely situated you in this interactive space. A smaller picture, I'm calling it a picture because there's a certain thing that your eye recognizes as a conventional picture. Because if you can see it without moving your eyes, and there's nothing in your peripheral vision, it's very satisfying. And that's why pictures are satisfying, because they fall into that space. If you start playing with peripheral vision and everything, that the artist is taking you out of that kind of comfort zone. So anyway, I could go on a lot about that, but is that enough to get going?
I would love you to, but I know since we don't have unlimited time, the method is part of how the book is laid out. So I was wondering if you could tell everybody a little bit about how that works. books.
Sure. I have to mention that I came on this project in 2020 when Mary called me in the darkest of days of lockdown, and we were just out of the blue about this project. And yet it was a project that Mary did not initiate. It was initiated by students. And I thought before we talk about the structure, if you could talk about who and how it came to be before we started working on it.
Yes, and it goes way back to 2008. And Dawn Ryan of Ultra Red, who was in my class at the time, and Michelle Dizone, that goes by Latipa now, her name. They said, oh, well, we have to record these lectures, and we have to photograph the notebooks. And they kind of started out to try to do this and found it was like an enormous project. And they burned out. And then Trista Mallory, who was at the ISP, who's a historian whose field is education, she took it on systematically, got all the archival material together, and worked on it, and then she had a baby. And the baby didn't sleep, and so she gave up. And that's when I called Juli. And of course, it wouldn't happen without Juli. And Juli has the work ethic of a medieval monk. And she cracked it.
So
in
kind.
the last
To
5
say
years.
it that way, because there's another way to say that. I'll take the medieval monk.
Right. And that's why it exists, basically. Yeah.
So one of the things that when this virtual banker's box, right?
Yeah,
Those things,
basically.
the virtual version of that was dumped. It was enormous, unbelievable. But it is about crafting something. And if you limit it to the high concept, which we agreed on, that this is not a textbook,
Right.
but a
Not a
performative
textbook.
document. Well, just like the last tumbler in a lock, it just came together. So that it had to be structured in 3 parts. It had to method, project, somewhat dialectically,
Yeah.
winding up with the field, which is the method and project in the field. But with Mary and I's, we like things in 3, we like mirrors, we're very structuralist in that way. The other thing that was very exciting to me about this book is it's also a curatorial endeavor, because so there's the editing and structuring of the book around these 3 components of Mary's concentric pedagogy, but it also has Mary's archive that were beautifully scanned by
Martine.
Martine. Thank you, Martine. And I had worked on an archive of Mary's before, related to postpartum document at the Generale, so that was a component. So there's a visual component, not just of artworks, but of research, the writing of things down, that really appealed to me, because I remember when we worked on postpartum document archive exhibition in 8 sort of cases, I had 2 cases that were research, and Simon's here, Lung, in the back. And I remember I brought Simon in because you were at UCLA. I was there as adjunct. And we laid out those 8 cases and, on just tables. And the research was the most fantastic for me, because I just wanted to bring an artist saying, y'all might have the desire and the intention and the talent for the whatever you're doing, and then you've got the shows, but the passage between the inspiration and the aspiration of making something involved so much research. And so we had all of these handwritten notes, and I remember I brought Simon in, and I'm like, like, our students need to look at this case in particular, you know? And it was tactile and analog and just lovely. So anyway, that was another project early on. And, you know, you had me when I saw the notes and the pedagogy, as well as the portfolios of the artists working with their MFA projects, some of which are in museums, by the way. And then in the second part of the book, so the first one is formations in the field of former MFA students and their MFA projects, along with the archival notes related to exhibition systems and work related to the method, the archive. And then in the second part of the book, which is on the project, which you'll talk about this in a moment, circled around a primal scene, worked out through an aesthetic proposition. Then the archive has these wonderful notes, and that's why I mentioned Michelle Montrellet, because I love the archive, and the notes are there about Michelle. Notes on psychoanalysis, feminism, and activism, and that's where the project comes in. And by the way, all of the silence that happens in watching, looking, and leaning in, that happens in this utopic moment of the classroom, the practice goes on, and that's why there's a little conversation with Andrea and Sharon and others about talking about the project, talking about what makes them tick in terms of many things, but this primal political scene. And then the third part, the archive, really has to do with, and I loved this as well because I taught for 7 years adjunct to Mary's project in the program, all the wonderful symposia, and being all of the project, the method and the project and people in the field. And then it's the public, you know, the public square, not Elon Musk's. The real public square of debate-specific practices and intergenerational dialogue. And that last section is really structured around Mary's discussion that you moderated at the Tate Modern on the passage of a few people through a rather brief period of time. And there are many people here who contributed to that. And that really is the intergenerational and international
It was
dialogue
on the internet. Online.
on the internet and political primal scenes cycling through. And I'm sure you're going to talk about that. And then the book ends, of course, based on Griselda Pollock, who, thank you, Griselda, for shepherding this project through Bloomsbury Press, had a moment with me saying, you know, of course, we're going to put a bibliography of books on, by, and about Mary's work, but also, and she said, you know, Julie, you can do this, an extended bibliography of the discursive sites that relate to everything in the book. So it's robust.
Can I ask you?
And performative. One more thing, because if it's not a textbook, it's not a handbook either, right? To just get you through it.
Yeah.
It's really on the passage of a few people through a rather brief period of time performatively. Anyway.
Can I ask, so a couple of terms there that might need, I would like to understand a little more.
Right.
Yeah.
So the political primal scene and the way that you're using the word projects, I'm not sure I'm 100% with
They're
you
connected.
on that. Could you, please?
Yeah.
Yes.
I thought we should backtrack just a little bit because talking about the method in relation to the object, and as you're saying, this rather utopian situation of being in the studio, this is a major curricular point of most art departments in standalone or university departments, the crit, right? So
That's
this is
right.
like a very special circumstance where you're viewing this one work. And I know that you were thinking at the time that I was describing the method of deciphering, that, okay, what do we do with whether I like it or not? What do we do with what happens on the side of the reader? What do we do on the side of the institution? Because you never ever see this work on its own. It's like our work is in the biennial. The biennial, we're no longer as artists the subjects. We're the subjects of the exhibition, but we're not the authors of the formulation. So we have the curatorial discourse, which is also, it needs to be thought about and negotiated, but not using something like psychoanalysis, because what you need here is something more like Foucault. You have to ask yourself, who's speaking in this institutional context, right? What are the dissonances and the connections in the actual work as it fits into the thematic organizations of that? And what's the image discourse there? So, so that led to the, doing the work called Exhibition and System, making that into a course, which is where you would then take the method into the context of its institutional site. On the other hand, this problem of what do I like in the work and what's on the side of the reader, I mean, just intuitively, I never went all the way to deconstruction because I was so committed to the reality of that object on its own. But if you take this side on the reader's side, that's where you need the psychoanalytic discourse, because that can tell you something about what the work is doing in that way that involves projection and interjection. And so that led to doing the courses on psychoanalysis. And I always said I'd never give that course unless someone actually really wanted it, because it's not as though that can solve all problems or address all, objects. Every object has its specific discourse, I believe, and we're capable of juggling many balls at one time. And that's what I think educationally what's required of us at the moment. So in terms of what came to be called the project, I mean, some people here who went through the interdisciplinary area can maybe add to this as well. But this is something that's very different from the method in terms of the studio practice, because it's trying to find what is the center of your practice. In order to do that, you do need some psychoanalytic interrogation. What you mentioned about the primal scene is that, taking off from Freud's suggestion, well, more than a suggestion, that the child is saying, where did I come from, right? The sexual scenario and the way that the child then fills in all the gaps in knowledge with fantasies, right, of that moment. I said, well, there's something kind of comparable in the way that it could extend that to say that there's the political primal scene, because you're also asking yourself, where did I come from and where do I fit in the grand social political scheme of things? Where am I placed? And this, for me, always loops back to Walter Benjamin and his suggestion that the past reoccurs and bears on the present and the future. And the thing it always turns around something missing, right? So what did I do wrong? What did my parents not do? Like us in the 70s in the anti-war movement, we would never let the Holocaust happen again. We would correct. We had a mission, but this mission is very unconsciously driven, because the child Lacan says the child doesn't listen to the parents. They just ask themselves, why are they telling me this? And trying to figure out what parental desire is has a lot to do with how you negotiate the historical moment, that you live in, right? Now, the other aspect that's important that we used to that most important in addressing the project is to think about something that Alain Badiou called the event. I mean, you don't have to necessarily buy the whole argument about the privileged moment of this subject of truth, but you do have to take something from that that asks the question of what is actually the thing driving you. If you were like lucky enough, I say, to be like part of, say, the AIDS activist moment, like Daunt was at that time, or if you have been part of a kind of any collective situation in which you've said, yes, that this is something that after this point I'm not the same, and that this is I want to be faithful to in a certain way. That tends to be what you hook onto as an artist that forms a project over all your work. And even if you wanted to be successful in the market, you could not second guess that. I mean, so the only thing that keeps you sane is to say, I do have something to say. I have my project, and you stay with that, right? So, in terms of how we used to kind of discuss this, it was beginning in that point of like personal connection, or what you might kind of call, what's the event? And let's say it's not some big political moment, but it's a love affair. I mean, that can work too. But you've got from that point to say, how do you connect this to the big picture? And this is where I would say that in terms of the notion of the project, this was very specific to the artists who were working at the time that I did the interdisciplinary program. They were people mostly that had social agendas, that wanted to do project-based work. And that's why I think of that as being more ideological in a way than the method. I mean, the method is just good for everybody. Critics, historians, artists, viewers of all sorts. I mean, it doesn't have a ideological, but it's in the same way. So with the project, it's a matter of how you structure a life's work. And just one more point, I'm going on too long.
No, it's great.
But Juli says the last part of the book is a transcription of the online conference that I did for the Tate Modern, in which I attempted to describe or work through my notion of the discursive site. I mean, that's the other piece of the puzzle that you have to put into the project, which is that from the 70s right through the 90s, what we tend to call identity politics gave us a way of thinking about something like site specificity, which was more than a location. And you could say it could be a community, it could be an oppositional movement. So then when you think about medium, so what are the rules here of a medium? They're very different. They're discursive. They come from the question that you're asking. So then it goes right back. I see Sharon sitting there right there. What was the question, that comes up? For example, her work in the show here is literally, she poses the question and the women speak to it. But in a kind of wider context, it fits into the question of the entire project that kind of goes over the life's work. So this doesn't speak to everyone, but I can say that for Sharon and myself more with confidence that it has to do with the women and the women's movement and the questions that come from that site, right? So that's something that we followed, right, or tracked, right? And this would be in terms of the conference, what I tried to do is go back to the very beginning of the first, women's group that I worked in, and, with Laura Mulvey and Juliet Mitchell, and before anybody was writing or speaking in public, and to ask the questions, to kind of go over this with all the people I'd worked with right up to the present day. And then what I saw is the kind of structure of how the site changed. If I'm thinking now specifically of the women's movement, which I say is not for everybody, but this is how it worked in that context. Is first of all, we had the conference structure, which was a physical meeting place that moved in the 80s into magazines, and people were associated through the magazines. And so everyone I'm talking to on the online thing that have that in common, and it kind of moved into teaching, kind of as people were older and were working in that way. That became the center and carried on the discursive site. So then you start to see the intergenerational thing, and you realize that a generation is not a biological entity. It's a cultural and intellectual inheritance, at least. So that is the, yeah.
Thank you. I think maybe this is a time we should open it to talk with everybody who's here, especially people who are recognizing part of this from their own life experience. But really, any questions or comments? And I think we have a microphone that we'll ask you to use so people who are joining us online can hear you. It always takes a minute.
Oh, well, maybe somebody would like to talk about what it was like being in the quick class.
She's looking at you, Sharon. On the spot.
Who else has been in
And
class?
how you use
How many
it.
else? Oh, every. You should start.
Oh, where's every?
You should start.
Let's see every.
Both of you.
We can both.
Things,
We can both cover it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is
And you use it in your own way.
in my own way. Caroline can speak to it, but differently. Because in a way, although we all left, so it is an extraordinary experience, and there are some maybe significant details about it. One is that what Mary said, it is incredibly joyful, and it is really exhaustive, not exhausting in any way. But so what Mary was calling forensic, I could also say it has such an amazing sort of durational element to it that is not, it's not Asher's sort of go until you get to some kind of authentic core. It's really like follow a path and follow a kind of, moderator. I mean, Mary really often being like, not yet. If we would start to go somewhere beyond where we were, she would pull us back to where we were. So I think there's something, one other piece maybe that wasn't spoken out loud is that with Mary's method, it does require that a work be done, which is not always a commitment inside of critique. But that is the commitment of the method, that the work has to be done, because otherwise how can we spend so much time over details that aren't necessarily determined, that are...
Is it always just one work per crit?
Yeah, but
We've done exhibitions, but they're,
that's different. Yeah. I mean, one work could be many things and could look like many things. And
that's it.
yeah, I guess, I don't know. There's some high points also. Every, you can take over now. There's some high points. Like there is this, when I was at least in the class, there was a nice moment at the end where Mary would then turn to the artist and say, "Did we get it right?" Which is a moment of, another ecstatic moment.
My I have a question that goes well with what you've just said. I wonder how you reconcile artist intent. You described a very sort of infallible logic, and what happens when that logic isn't right or doesn't accurately reflect what this artist is trying to do or trying to say? I understand that those two things might not always go in hand, but what do you say to that person?
That's an excellent question, and that's exactly how it works. Is that if the artist has an attentive viewer, and they have a chance to see what that attentive viewer can do with what they've made, and if it's really off, they can see that they have to change it. But you don't tell them that. You know, it's what you see someone is getting out of it if they're careful. And then that kind of self-corrects. Yeah.
Hi. I don't want to speak too much because I love hearing Mary's voice again. But I was a student some years ago, quite some years ago. And what I want to add to speak about the experience, about what Sharon was also just saying, is I just want to say two things. Is it's extraordinary to view artworks with a group of people when you have no imperative to judgment. So I hadn't heard of that idea before. You know, when I got to school, I still felt very young as an artist. And it was such a privilege to just think through and with and not judge. And that was one of the, you know, if I had taken anything from those 3 years at school, thank you. The other thing I thought was so beautiful about the method is that you trust the artist. Very big deal, because most of the time you can enter a space and we don't know, like what you're talking about, like the intention. We don't know some of the, you know, politics around production. There's so many questions you can have. But in this space, what we do is we trust the artist, and we, to have made the decisions that produce the thing that we are caring about and considering so closely. So I also think that was a really wonderful position to be in as a viewer, and something that I've carried through to my life as a maker.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary.
I'm glad that you brought out how collaborative it is, because it needs the collective to happen, because you can't, one person doing it on their own, it's not enough voices to correct one another. And so it was always in the group, which is why I didn't ever feel I could write it down, because it happens in the moment, right? And with people, doing it. That's.
This is a question from a little bit outside of the circle, and maybe more of a historical question. Since you began by talking about CalArts and Asher in particular, I was wondering if, to what extent the legacy of the feminist art program at CalArts and the circle method that Judy Chicago and implemented there was at all a reference point or being discussed at CalArts at the time.
Well, for me, it's not, because I was in London, lived in London at that time when I visited CalArts. And so my kind of base and experience in the women's movement started there. And I was probably, I was aligned with women who were involved, first of all, in kind of the other kind of social movements of the time, and then moved over into the women's movement and recognized that it was needed its separate structure, but never autonomous from other things. It's what you'd call intersectional now. But at that time, it was a rather different tendency that I kind of came out of, and I was very influenced also by people in film more in that time. But we did, I don't know so much about the Woman House experience, but I know lots of artists who were part of it, that were colleagues and things. But your question is, how had that influenced people at CalArts in that time? Yeah, sorry, can't do that. Did
I have
answer
something
that
I
one?
can add to that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, one of the things we have concentric versus phallocentric is sort of this guiding thing. There's concentric versus X within, not CC, X, EX centric. And for me, that also points towards going back to Lacan and psychoanalysis.
You just like did that towards me. That feels really weird. I'm not ready to be spoken of by
Because it's the first question you asked me, and I haven't answered anything psychoanalytically yet. So it was a demand. I'm answering. I've come. I've called. So the Lacan talks about like how we are exteroceptively come in, meaning active. That's a biological terms, really, but activated from the outside, right? And you don't have to like Lacan. You can like Nietzsche. You can like a whole bunch of people who have theorized this notion, this non-Cartesian notion that everything comes from within, but activated from without. And I was thinking about that part. I didn't really write about this in the introduction, but I've been thinking about it reviewing the book. Is you have concentric and eccentric with an X, and I think it points towards something that you're directing, that at Cal Arts and other places, but Cal Arts, you have the legacy of this American feminism that was not Mary's discursive scene. She described what it was. And then on the other hand, Michael Asher, or if you go forward to the ISP, teaching alongside Benjamin Buchloh, a different model, and at UCLA, Chris Burden and others. And that's the exterior. And even though deconstruction is not Mary's word, but I'm going to kind of use it a little bit because we're colleagues.
I can disagree.
We're colleagues. So I'm more Derrida friendly. But in this non-oppositional way, it's not this model versus a Chicago, a Buchloh, and Asher, which are all operating differently, but it's vis-a-vis. And that is really important to me about your practice. Sorry, did I?
No, we're saying it.
Yeah,
Go,
that's
go.
perfect.
Yeah, there you go.
A question I just kind of wanted to put out is, to what degree is it a feminist method of teaching?
There you go.
Right. Well, as I was saying in the beginning, thinking about it, what I'm doing here is we know about feminism as a content, say in women's studies, but what I was thinking about is feminism as a tactic.
That's right.
And there's like, in terms of history, like Hayden White's notion that we have history of dreams and memory, but we also have history which is about tactics that we want to live in the present. And it kind of occurred to me that what I was just intuitively doing in the method, the CRIP method, was applying a tactic of feminism. There was no content of feminism in the course, and in fact, one of the most important things, like every was saying, was not to presuppose someone's work had anything to do with sexuality or had anything to do with politics, or it had to be completely open to that. Yeah,
Which goes to the feminist problematic versus a feminist method, which is also why it was really important to both of us, but singularly to me as well, that the book be performative in that way, because the feminist problematic is a performative.
Can you explain how you're using that?
Yeah,
one?
so it's a perspective vis-a-vis a phallocentric symbolic organization, world, what have you, with all the different authors and traditions that we've mentioned tonight. And it's a perspective, this is my interpretation, Mary's gonna chime in or disagree, but it's this perspective filled with tactics to exist, to unpack some of these things, to come at it. When you say concentric versus phallocentric, that's a tactic against another thing, but that concentricity doesn't give you subject matter.
Right.
It doesn't give you necessarily sexuality. When you hear the word feminist method with, I'm going to say capital F,
Okay.
whether or not that's the way it's meant, you generally go to genre, movement, content. This might intersect very well with some things that are in the bucket. So for me, it was very important that you would see a passage of a bunch of folks, you know, go through essays and archives and documentation and conversations, always conversations in each 3 sections, that would let you see the diversity of practice around a feminist problematic as a tactic, that it does something to this other scene. And when you look at the book and you look at the portfolios, they don't look the same. You know, I was telling you earlier, you know, it's an art historical kind of, I can't put them in. Is it sculpture? And this is interdisciplinary, which is not multimedia.
Of course.
So
Heaven forfend.
multimedia is kind of like feminist method, you know, in terms. Interdisciplinary, as I always understood it, was disciplines interrogating each other. And, or not, but why don't you talk about, we had these conversations in the olden days, but how would you describe interdisciplinary in terms of your area that you were running?
Well, actually, I wanted to call it
There you
transdisciplinary
go.
after Homi Bhabha, but the dean wouldn't have it. So they understood interdisciplinary better. But transdisciplinary would be that first you have the question and you go where you need to go to answer it.
Right.
Right.
So it's just not piling on one convention onto another. That's all I meant.
Oh yeah, hi. Oh hi.
Great.
Hi Mary. It's Carolyn, I'm over here.
Oh, Carolyn.
This way.
Okay.
Hi. I just for kicks, I thought I'd add to the pedagogical telephone game and talk about my experience of Sharon's pedagogy, which is also your pedagogy, which is, or what I wanted to say was just something about description, which my understanding, or as I remember it, is so much of Sharon's critique structure starts off with description, and also Sharon similarly moderates the conversation to stop people from moving into interpretation. And I think there's something about that that's actually about the way that description and interpretation are actually non-oppositional, and that through description, like it's impossible to think about description in a way that's not mediated by the describer. And so we get to where we need to get through description versus, say, like the Asher approach. And unfortunately, there's no one who's studied with me to talk about how I've garbled all of this, but thank you.
Is that
Rosalind,
Isabel?
did you? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm using my power.
So last
It's all good.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary, for your work and for sharing your pedagogy with us. I'm coming as someone who's I'm a student of Carrie's, art history student, and your method really resonated for me with a lot of, I think, what many of us try and do in art history classrooms, of starting with really just close looking and a place of non-judgmental stance, and also I think what a lot of museum educators try and do with singling out a kind of long look with a single work of art. And I was thinking about the resonances I saw with your method, but then I realized one of the key differences is, of course, the presence of the artist. And you mentioned that you see this method as having the potential to be something for many people, for critics, for artists, for students. And I was wondering if you could speak to how you understand the method working in the absence of the artist.
Excuse me.
If it has a potential. but if it has the potential to work in the absence of the artist, or how it perhaps changes in the absence of their actual presence in the group.
I think it's more about how it changes when you're alone and not with people, to bounce your comments off. And you try this when you go to an exhibition. If you remember being in the method, you might try, but it's usually very distracted, and you don't have the benefit of that interdiscursive moment. But I still think it sticks with you. Sorry.
One last one? Okay, one last one. If that's okay. Do you need more? Are you okay with water?
Do you have any advice for a first-time teacher leading their own crit?
Yeah, the book.
But it's performative, not prescriptive.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
It's its own object to be deciphered.
Right.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.